So the fourth module is on human development needs and bonding. Now that sounds pretty psychotherapeutic because it's very psychotherapeutic. So I'll just read this quickly. Fitting in produces an anxiety, while belonging resolves an instinctual need. Your personality, adaptability, and sense of self develop in an environment of needs, connection, and meaning. There are 6 ways that we learn, grow, and become a complete self. We have an instinctual need for physical survival. Anytime that's thwarted, that builds deep patterns in who we are. Viscerally, especially around trust and shame and connection and belonging, is a need, and depending on how that's gone, that may make us very happy, open, loving people, or very sideways, very guarded, very, either defiant or defeated people. We have an intuition and a need to trust that we can sense into what's going on with people. This is called neuroception. It's how we actually read people's body language and have a sense of how any conversation or connection is going. We have the need to be emotionally agile, emotionally expressive, emotionally curious. But depending on our conditioning and what's allowed in our culture, that can also be thwarted. And that's a very, very, very difficult thing to work with. Because how do you heal emotionally when you're not allowed to feel your feelings? So we'll go deep into that. There's also the egoic part. We all have to build a self, and at some point, maybe in our spiritual trajectory, as we get older and wiser, we can begin to let go of that self. But if you don't build a self that you're actually really content with and feeling whole as an egoic person within a community, within a family, within a relationship, then you're going to always feel a bit insecure or a bit like we have to compensate for something. And that can be very, very tricky. I'll speak to my experience quickly. A few years ago, I was diagnosed finally as being a specific kind of atypical autism with a little side dish of ADHD, which when I found out, I actually cried and laughed for about 2 days in the best possible way, because my entire life, in the sense of forming myself and what felt right and what didn't seem to click, suddenly made sense. So when we form our ego in the Western world, I mean, high school, that's a huge thing. How relationship goes and popularity goes, really big thing. How we fit into the world around success or economic things. And even the car we drive is an extension of our ego, depending on how old we are. So we want to attend to that so that we can be in the center of it instead of always trying harder or giving up. And that's just such a beautiful opportunity to take home and to be with. And then there's this existential part of being a human, which is why? What does this mean? How come this keeps happening? And then we look at the world, the universe, maybe depending on the paradigm you might live in. Finding that why and finding that existential truth and meaning is also a necessary anchor for us to get through the hardest things that we may experience in life. And life seems to want to check and see how we're doing every 10 years or so by, bumping us into something that's really challenging. And if we don't really have a sense of an existential why or a bigger truth, we're facing those challenges in a way very alone, in a way very much just in the left brain, in a way very much just trying to either get through it or give up on even trying. And as we go through that module, we're going to speak a little bit about developmental psychology. The Western model is very nicely sort of laid out. We're going to especially look at this truth that a lot of distress, certain aspects of trauma come up and they're easily triggered. And the trigger often isn't just about the trauma, it's about the need to resolve that or other needs that were unmet in our life as children. So when we face a really existential dilemma, in many ways. If we don't have certain needs met in our life, then the one facing that big dilemma is a person who feels insecure or like we're missing something. I know I've felt that sometimes in my life. And when I learned that I needed to resolve those unmet needs by finding ways to meet them, then I realized, oh, of course, because I was limping in a way. I didn't have a part of myself that was really integrated into my sense of who I really am. And that in itself has changed more people's lives than I can think of almost anything else we'll get into. There's a thing that we call adverse childhood experiences, ACE. I would encourage you to go online, type in ACE. There's a little questionnaire you can do that will give you a very clear sense about how your childhood went in the sense of adverse experiences and how likely that may be, given those questionnaires, to remind you of some unmet needs or some experiences that have disoriented your sense of will. And it's not meant to solve anything, it's meant to bring us home to the truth of our life. We're going to speak a little bit about inner child work in the context of recapitulation, but I've always found, and I'll get into a story about this when we go into the course, it makes more sense to, and this is a First Nations teaching, by the way, it makes more sense to embrace your inner grandmother, the one who's got the patience, the wisdom, the care, the willingness to make a pot of soup and, sit and be present to the child, the adolescent, the adult, who is still, you could say, in turmoil in some way. And we'll do a fun story about that, which makes everyone laugh until we almost pee ourselves, because it is kind of funny. There's also an aspect of life that just has to do with latent wounds, and this is a component of Chinese medicine that's also not really, at least in what I've seen, a big thing we call fu xie, which means latent pathogens, and that can mean a low-grade infection hidden somewhere in your ileocecal valve or something. But it can also mean a kind of wound that we just don't recognize in the context of woundedness, because it just seems to be like an agitation that drives us forward. But when we start looking into those latent things that are kind of behind the curtains or in the basement of the mind that might be forming a part of our identity, and we kind of bring them into consciousness, bring them into the willingness to interact, excuse me, then we have a chance to really allow our identity to include the things that are easy to understand, and the things that we know we're still kind of unearthing in a way, or bringing out of the somatic self into the conscious self. And that's, I think, maybe a 10-year process if you practice like Qigong, yoga, different kinds of expressive dance, where, if that worked once, we could all go to one Qigong class and be like, okay, well, I'm good. Which would be weird, but when we're getting into practices that give us more confidence with feeling, move, acknowledge, release, however that might work in your practice, now the late wounds are going to kind of sort of say, hey, I've been, in the basement for, 6 generations now. It'd be kind of nice to come out and be in the sun with the rest of consciousness. And the closing circle for that module is called the 4 Colors of Time, which, as I mentioned, teaching Aboriginal education, that one's in the top 2 or 3 that people say that changed everything. And I won't go into that now because it's quite the conversation. But imagine recognizing that we're all very much in our own world, in our own reality. And I don't mean that in the pathological sense. I mean that in the appreciation of each other in the state we're in. Because let's say I'm in a really big hurry to go on an adventure, and my partner is in a really, really slow need to do some journaling. We're in different colors of time. There's so much more to that, but just as an example.